Welcome to Arab Center, Washington. We have a special program for you today, a session on the way forward in Libya, assessing regional and international initiative, a diplomatic analysis. Traditionally, as many of you who have participated in our past events know, we usually hold these events at the National Press Club with continental breakfast involved. Unfortunately, today there is no continental breakfast. You're on your own. However, what we have for you is an intercontinental smorgasbord of ideas to share experiences from people who have been very involved politically and diplomatically in this issue with regards to the conflict in Libya. Since the Libyan upheaval rid Libya of Gaddafi back, I would say almost 9 years ago, on the 20th of October 2011, the country has been living total chaos and civil war, unable, unfortunately, to regain its equilibrium and begin a new phase of its history by rebuilding the country on a healthy, modern, and democratic basis to serve its talented and well-deserving people who have suffered for 42 years of authoritarian rule prior to that under Gaddafi. Today, it looks like the conflict in Libya is again showing some signs of an opening, an opportunity. The past few weeks, people have been talking about some changes on the ground that give the international community, if the will and the intention is there, to take advantage of this and see if this time a serious effort, worthy effort, can be spent to end this conflict, really, and help or nudge Libya to move forward. This has not been the first such opportunity, but we hope it's the last, in the sense that we hope that this time the international community would rise up to the occasion with similar, if not more intensive effort and more dedication than in the past to try to make a difference. We have, again, 3 speakers today in this briefing, and each one will have about 15 minutes to make their case as to what needs to be done, their own assessments in terms of how Libya can or may move forward, after which we will begin a conversation with you, and you have a chance to ask questions from all participants. And you may use basically the Zoom chat mechanism to send your questions. Staff will forward those to me, and I'll be more than glad to accommodate as many as possible by directing the questions to the participants. Please indicate your name, your affiliation, if you care to do so, and make it a brief question rather than a speech or a long comment. Short comments are fine. The reason we want to do that is to try to give everybody a chance. Our time will be divided almost in half today, so all 3 speakers would have, as I said, together 45 minutes, plus the balance of the time would be dedicated to the Q&A session. We're going to begin. I'm going to introduce our guest speakers by the order in which they will speak. I'll just take a couple minutes to introduce each, and we'll proceed with their presentation. Our first speaker today is from the United Nations, Stephanie Williams, who has also spent a career here at the State Department and representing the US as a diplomat in various parts of the Middle East, is currently working with the United Nations on Libya. And she is basically served as special representative in Libya after the departure of Ghassan Salami of Lebanon from that position. And she continues to work in a senior capacity at United Nations Special Mission in Libya at this time. Stephanie has, like I said, spent more than 24 years in the US government and international affairs in general. She has served as Deputy Special Representative since 2018 at the UN Special Mission. Prior to her appointment to that, she served as Chargée d'Affaires at the US Embassy in Tripoli. So she knew the Libyan conflict from both ends, if you will, of the equation, the US and the international aspect. She has held various positions as deputy mission in Iraq, in Jordan, in Bahrain. And so she knows the region rather well. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Stephanie, and the microphone is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Khalil, and I'm really delighted to join the Arab Center today and to also participate on a very distinguished panel with my two co-panelists, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from them as well as interacting with what looked like to be a rather sizable audience. So what I would like to do is sort of, I think, set the scene and give you the perspective of the United Nations with regard to the current developments in Libya. So really, as you noted in your introduction, there's been a drastic change on the ground, the tactical situation in Libya, the battlefield dynamics, and that really going the past 2 months. We've seen a dramatic withdrawal of General Haftar's forces from Western Libya, starting with the takeover of the coastal cities, the Western coastal cities, the takeover of Woutia Air Base, the pushback of his forces from southern Tripoli, then from Tarhuna, moving on to Beni Walid, and pretty much the GNA forces have, continued their advances, pushing him 280 miles eastward. Now outside, the GNA forces are on the eastern side of the central city of Sirte, and then you have General Haftar's affiliated forces on the western side of Sirte. And there they have been. We've had calm on the ground, basically for the last 2 weeks, while, as I say, the elephants are dancing. You've got a lot of activity on the international and regional stage with obviously some of the primary foreign backers of the conflict. Namely, you have meetings between planned and then aborted meetings between the Turks and the Russians, and then a lot of other activity regionally, including President Sisi's announcement a few days ago. So we have these red lines that have now been set by both the domestic parties to the conflict and the international parties to the conflict. And the red lines now are Sirte, Jufra, and essentially the Oil Crescent. So Sirte being a red line is a kind of a new development in Libya. As you recall, it wasn't a red line, for instance, in 2016, when you had GNA forces battling Daesh to extricate Daesh and defeat Daesh in the city of Sirte. And indeed, the GNA held Sirte from that time until January of this year. So it just shows you how complex the situation on the ground is, both between the two parties to the conflict, as well as now this very intense and worrying regional dynamic. Now, I think in terms of the perspective from Tripoli, how we view what's the thinking, what's the dynamic for the GNA forces, there's a risk of triumphalism, of overextending the GNA forces and repeating the same mistakes that frankly Haftar and his forces made on their march, towards and into Tripoli in April of last year. So, and none of this can be sustained without, of course, the intense foreign interference and supply of weapons to both sides. So as we look at the situation now in central Libya, we as the United Nations, our concern is protection of the civilian population. There are 60,000 civilians in harm's way in the city of Sirte right now. And I don't need to, tell you, this is a city that has seen a lot of conflict over the last 9 years, starting with the revolution, and then of course the occupation of Daesh and the battle to push Daesh out, enormous destruction. And they were really just beginning to, put the city back together to rebuild. So we want to really spare Sirte and its people from further trauma. So as I said, look, this internal dynamic is completely fed by the external interference, and we have seen, I feel like a broken record. We talk continually about the blatant violations of the arms embargo, and it's just daily flights, ships, and I lost count of the number of mercenaries in Libya now, because you have, basically now you have Syrians, Sudanese, and Chadians on both sides of the conflict, and they're still coming in. Not to mention, the infamous, Wagner PMC mercenaries, which had, which drew the wrath of Washington and sort of, brought the U.S. perhaps more back into the equation after a period of absence. So, and these are the countries that are violating the arms embargo are the same countries that sat around the table on the 19th of January in Berlin and pledged to commit themselves to upholding this arms embargo and a whole series of other commitments. So more broadly speaking on what the last 14 months, not to mention the past 9 years, but let's just focus on the last 14 months of conflict in and around Tripoli and in Western Libya. The impact on the civilians has been enormous. And this is a very small population. You're talking about 7 million Libyans. So we have over 400,000 people now displaced. We have, just in the recent military movements where Haftar's forces were pushed out of southern Tripoli and Tarhuna, and to an extent, what happened in Beni Walid, there are now 27,500 more IDPs. They've been forced to flee their homes. These are people who have now been displaced westwards. You see them now in Benghazi and Ashdabia, already, building on already large populations of IDPs. The other impact on the civilian population that has been noteworthy of late is when Haftar's forces withdrew from southern Tripoli, they left behind some very nasty and deadly devices. These IEDs, these explosive remnants of war, these really imperiled the safety and security of civilians who were quite understandably trying to return to their homes. So these were the IDPs who were pushed into central Tripoli, into very densely populated areas, wanting to go back, naturally wanting to go back and see their homes. And so they have been impacted by these IEDs, and also security personnel from the GNA who've gone in to try and disable them. So we've seen over 100 civilians and security personnel killed or injured by these IEDs left in southern Tripoli. Overall, between the 1st of April and the 11th of June, civilian casualties increased dramatically. We documented 250 civilian casualties, including 82 civilians killed and 168 civilians injured. Now, this is also, all of this is happening at a time when the country's dealing with the COVID pandemic. And what we have seen in the last couple of weeks is a really worrying spike. Initially, when COVID hit Libya, the numbers were, didn't really change. In the last week, last couple of weeks, we've seen a spike now up to 670 cases, 18 dead. And particularly worrisome is the situation in the south, in Sebha and Ubadi, and these are areas that are underserviced by the central government. And so people are dealing with conflict and COVID, and the two are colluding, and that also, frankly, has an impact on our access and ability to reach people. Also, we have a crisis of accountability and overall human rights violation, which has been accentuated recently. And that's, of course, the very grisly and horrific discovery of mass graves in and around Tarhuna. There's no secret that, what in the last year, 14 months, has now an LNA affiliated group, the Kaniyat, are a murderous bunch, and but yet these mass graves have been highly disturbing. We have received an official request from the GNA to provide assistance and support, and we have responded to that request. The ICC prosecutor, Madam Bensouda, has also issued a very strong statement noting that she's not going to hesitate to expand the ICC's investigation and potential prosecutions to cover any new crimes. In addition, this week, finally, in Geneva, the Human Rights Council approved the establishment of a much needed fact-finding mission. They're going to get busy appointing the experts and putting the staff into place. That commission is going to need, that mission's going to need to have total and unfettered access all over Libya. Because without accountability, without justice, there's not going to be peace. And so this all needs to sort of march in lockstep. So the other piece here is that, of course, the social media environment, there's tremendous polarization in Libya. It's a battle as much on the ground as it is in social media, and the two feed each other very unhelpfully. This leads to acts of retaliation. There are increasing reports, of course, incitement of hatred, horrible images of people committing war crimes online, including desecration of corpses. And this is all just tearing the social fabric of the country apart and leading to this polarization and this, internal and external fear now of actual partition. So today, actually, we are marking the 6-year anniversary of the brutal killing of Salwa Boulafis, who was a political activist, a human rights activist, killed in Benghazi in her home. We are also this month marking the 6-year anniversary of the slaying of Fariha Berkawi, an MP from Derna, shortly after Salwa was murdered. And next month, we come up to the 1-year anniversary of the brutal abduction of Seham Sarewa from her home in Benghazi. So, this just speaks to the complete and total impunity that is prevailing in Libya, and that really needs to end. If we want to give, a political solution and peace a lasting chance. I'll briefly touch now on the Berlin process and what we're doing. We believe there is still an opportunity for Berlin and its conclusions to bear fruit. But frankly, it's going to require the participants in Berlin to really recommit themselves to the principles and outcomes that they signed up to and that were enshrined in a UN Security Council resolution, which was hard sought. You will remember that after Haftar's forces moved in to Tripoli in April, there was a period where the Security Council was entirely sterile. Nothing could be produced because of the disagreements and divisions, particularly amongst the P5. And that was the logic that led the former SRSG, Ghassan Salama, to devise the Berlin process and to bring in the Germans. And great credit goes to Chancellor Merkel, who was able to get leaders around the table in January. Now, I mean, the whole purpose of Berlin also was to pull the Europeans in, recognizing that, you know, the US was not and could not play its traditional role. So you pull the Europeans in and you hope that they can unite and that they can actually use all the tools in the tool chest to pursue a solution and to, you know, use sanctions, use your trading and investment relationships with the regional powers who are fueling the conflict. I still think that's possible, and it's in Europe's interest to do this because chaos in the southern Mediterranean is not gonna imperil their national security interests. So we started Berlin. We started the Libyan tracks. Of course, we had physical meetings. Then we had COVID. Now we're having virtual meetings. We have reconvened the 5+5 Joint Military Commission talks, which have been held virtually. They are parallel talks still. These are not talks where they're actually face-to-face or with each other. But what we have been able to do in this third round is to reconfirm, you know, some of the really serious points of consensus that were reached in the first two rounds in Geneva. And there is convergence. There's important convergence here. We shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We should. There are the convergence is on issues such as the need for mercenaries and foreign forces to depart Libya within like a 90-day period of the signing under UN monitoring. There's a recommitment to counterterrorism cooperation between the two sides to the conflict, and the need for DDR throughout Libya. DDR is not just a problem in Western Libya. It's a problem throughout Libya. There is recognition. I think that there is a lot that we can build on in terms of what was the points of convergence and consensus. Quickly on the political process, we see now there's maybe a little bit of an opening with in the east of Libya. There are some more voices coming forward. We certainly saw, you know, with Aguila's, the HOR speakers initiative, you know, perhaps an opportunity to build on that with, you know, partners in Western Libya. And we have, you know, there was definitely a political process that was designed per Berlin, but, you know, we think that we can actually take the various initiatives that are on the table now and again, find points of convergence that we can build on. But, you know, ultimately, the ingredients to a political solution in Libya are not a mystery. They're known to the Libyans, they're known to the international community. What is needed is, you know, basically the international community has to agree on presenting a united front to the Libyans, so that the UN can proceed with a genuine Libyan-led, fully inclusive political process. If there's divergence, if the Libyans see with it there are divisions, they're going to exploit those divisions, particularly, you know, what we call the members of the largest party in Libya, and that's the party of the status quo. And those people don't want any change. They are enjoying, you know, they are profiting, literally profiting from conflict. I'll just, you know, wrap up by saying, look, I mean, considering that this is taking place in Washington, I think, and for a Washington audience, I think there's a real danger of drift in Libya right now. With it can go one of two ways. I think you're right. There has been some calm. There is, you know, certainly the situation in Tripoli is better, but I am genuinely worried about regional escalation now, and miscalculation. And once this violence kicks off, it could be quite hard to contain. I see that the risk of direct foreign intervention is much more acute now. I see that there is the risk of partition of Libya, of some kind of Cyprus model, North Cyprus, South Cyprus model is much more real now. And that is just a recipe for continued violence and instability. And again, this comes back to, you know, there are many interests that will be affected, and it does not, you know, assuredly Libya's direct neighbors are going to be the most affected, but the Mediterranean region and beyond is also at risk of not paying attention to this crisis. It is, stop making it priority number 4 or 5 on the list. Let's move it up the list, and let's work towards, you know, peace, lasting peace and stability in Libya. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. Appreciate your detailed and thorough analysis of the situation. And now, again, just a short reminder to the participants that you may continue. I'm beginning to get some good questions for the speakers, and continue to send those again through the Q&A mechanism on your page, but you may also do that by email. Those of you who are watching on the website, Arab Center Washington website, just mail to arabcenterdc.org, and the staff will transfer also those to me so we can discuss those. Our next participant today is Dr. Tarek Mitri. Dr. Mitri is currently president of St. George University in Beirut, Lebanon. He has served, as many of you know, as director for several years, since 2014 actually, of the AUB's Issam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs. And with regards to Libya, he also is the former special representative of the United Nations Secretary General in Libya. Dr. Mitri has also been an experienced political figure in Lebanon. He has served his country in various capacities, ministerial capacities, including Minister of Information, Environment, Administrative Development and Culture, and acting foreign minister. He's also a member of the strategic board of Lebanon's Université Saint-Joseph, the chair of the board of trustees of the Institute of Palestine Studies, and a member of the board of directors of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, our colleagues based in Doha. He has lectured in several universities in Lebanon, Europe, and North America. Dr. Tarek, we are definitely honored to have you today as part of this panel. Please go ahead.
It's indeed an honor and a pleasure to be a panelist with 2 distinguished colleagues. Let me say first how much I admire the courage of Stephanie and her colleagues at UNSMIL, some of whom I know and I've worked with, as they get on with their difficult but extremely important work against all odds. I often think of what you go through in Tripoli. It's good to see Jonathan after so many years as well. The establishment of an international fact-finding mission to Libya pursuant to the resolution adopted by the United Nations Human Rights Council is a sign that the plight of the civilians in Libya is not occulted nor forgotten. The declaration of Abu Bensouda, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, about receiving credible information regarding mass graves in Tarhuna, which may constitute evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity, is equally important. Both are a reminder to all of us of the heavy cost paid by the Libyan civilian population throughout the recent large-scale conflict. And this should never be understated in the search for a political compromise. Needless to say that more often than not, Libya is perceived by some, perhaps many, foreign actors as a battleground of proxy wars of influence. Unfortunately, there has always been Libyan factions who saw their own country as a battleground. And are inclined in their enmities and struggle for power to invite, justify, and support foreign interference. And to reinforce, as I said, perhaps unwillingly, the perception of their country as a little more than an arena of regional and international rivalries. In this context, a Manichaean view of internal dynamics seem to prevail. The dualistic portrayal of internal contradiction is not only reductionist, it is instrumentalized in the local political competition, but also in providing pretexts for foreign intervention. But the conflicts in Libya are not, if I'm allowed the word, are not avatars of a primal antagonism between Cyrenaica and Tripolitana. They do not express the ancestral tribal hatred in Libya. They do not define bloody borders between the so-called liberals that are more or less, God knows, secular Libyans and Islamists who are often amalgamated with radical groups or with terrorists. Nor is the conflict in Libya an opposition between an army and militias. It's militias versus militias. It has been repeatedly said that both in Libya and outside, that there is no military solution to the conflict. But reasonable statements notwithstanding, the way some actors operate, their body language, as it were, suggests that they have not given up on the illusion of achieving a military victory. The mounting hostile warnings that are voiced and the reference to the red lines depict possible military interventions as responses to existential threats, euphemistically called issues of national security. Every time I met an Egyptian official foreign minister, I was told Libya mas'alat amn al-qawmi is an issue of national security. Several diplomatic initiatives called for a permanent ceasefire. They prompted actors to focus on limiting the influence of external powers who continue to supply various factions with mercenaries, arms, planes, drones, and ground-to-air defense. All of this in blatant violation of the UN Security Council embargo resolution 1970. The recent Egyptian initiative is not different, in my view, from previous mediation proposed or attempts at agreements, but I will qualify the statement. Yet it leaves unresolved controversial issues that derail every diplomatic attempt. And as it is often the case, the terms of negotiations lend themselves to diverging interpretations. The announcement that the Egyptian army is on high alert to combat all dangers does not position Egypt as a peacemaker. Far from it. Praising its initiative by the Arab League does not necessarily mean that it's an initiative eligible to solve the Libya crisis politically. The threat of intervention does not help in delegitimizing other foreign interventions, no matter if it has received some Arab and international support. Egypt's initiative is, to be sure, a strong warning that this neighbor of Libya could intervene to stop the GNA forces' advance, reaching Sirte and beyond. In short, it may be quite problematic for Egypt to be at the same time a party to the conflict and a mediator, no matter what the initiative says. Egypt is largely perceived as reactive, and its initiative is interpreted by some as an attempt to regain influence lost by Haftar's failure in Tripolitania, and impede a putative Turkish-Russian deal. Turkey and Russia, to name those two, might be able to cooperate, their disagreements notwithstanding. They will most likely avoid a direct confrontation. Russia has no appetite for that. While they will possibly let their Libyan friends, clients, whatever, allies or proxies, you choose the word you want, fight with the limited ambition of setting the boundaries of their spheres of influence. In these two countries, if these two countries reach an understanding, this does not mean the pacification of Libya. It is unlikely that the fight over Sirte and Jufra, the Egyptian so-called red line, would lead to a large-scale war. The situation is volatile. There might be low intensity, middle intensity, whatever you would like to call them, fighting. But it may preclude a period of mutual deterrence with a limited effect, unfortunately, on political negotiations. When you speak of this complex relationship between Russia and Turkey, you cannot but think of Syria. Recently, Le Monde wrote a series of articles about la syrianisation de la Libye, the Syrianization of Libya. Remains to be seen if that comparison is credible. No other foreign actor, for the time being, has the will or the capacity to play a meaningful military role in Libya. The European Union maritime operation, IRINI, does quite a little to prevent arms shipments. But it can be a deterrent against, perhaps against illegal oil exports. Western leverage, whether US or European, is strongest in imposing sanctions and using influence in financial institutions. An extensive use of US and European Union sanctions against companies, groups, and individuals involved in violating the arms embargo may contribute to limiting the scope of foreign interference. Just limiting the scope, not much more. Now, a few words about the political process. The political process remains deadlocked. Perhaps a new negotiating framework needs to be designed. A constitutionally watertight agreement is not a realistic objective. Libyan institutions have demonstrated time and again that they will not agree to any solution that might make them redundant. All parties are in a, what you may call a constitutional limbo. Their legitimacy has eroded in different ways, even among their respective supporters. Be that as it may, and short of bringing to life the totality of the UN Security Council Resolution 2510, the United Nations, backed by the parties or some of the parties that were at Berlin, can offer some contribution in implementing what has been agreed on in Berlin. More specifically, the UN is, and to revitalize, it is doing so, further its role of both a mediator and convener of the former thematic technical groups, addressing issues of security, economic and international humanitarian law, as well as human rights. More critical, in my view, is the intensification of the ongoing 5+5 joint military commission negotiations on cessation of hostilities, repatriation of foreign mercenaries, withdrawal of foreign military forces, and moving towards building, or rather rebuilding, the security sector, and the disarmament and reintegration of the military groups in the country. This is, of course, a very ambitious agenda. But the point I'm trying to make is that this is very much an internal Libyan, should be Libyan-owned process. And the UN facilitates, convenes, and mediates. Leaders and representatives of armed groups, whatever they call themselves, brigades, army, I mean, there are a million, whatever they call themselves, they have to be a party in any negotiation. And this is for a good number of obvious reasons. They all have a stake in an agreement. They are capable of obstructing its implementation if they see it as a threat to their survival. In short, no discussion on unifying and reforming security institutions can progress unless those very groups are convinced that some of their interests, which they consider to be legitimate, some of their interests, are duly taken into consideration. More broadly, we learn from past experience in the last 8 years that a negotiations agreement on reunification and reform of state institutions is more vital than the exaggerated importance given in seeking a power sharing accord. Rebuilding the institutions is more important than agreeing on a magic power sharing formula. This is all I wanted to say. I am aware that it is very difficult to disentangle the internal and the external from the external determinants of the conflict in Libya. But progressing on, even if it is modest, on the internal track, might help avoiding another disaster. Thank you.
Thank you, Tarek, for your extensive presentation here, focusing on your practical experience. I assume a lot of that came across in your remarks, issues that need to be tackled, particularly if the UN and the international community is to embark on a new initiative. Our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Jonathan Weiner. Jonathan is right now a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute here in Washington, D.C. He has been the United States Special Envoy for Libya, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Law Enforcement, and counsel to United States Senator John Kerry. He has written and lectured widely on U.S. Middle East policy, on counterterrorism, international money laundering, illicit networks, corruption, and U.S.-Russia issues. In 2016, Jonathan received the highest award granted by the Secretary of State for extraordinary service to the U.S. government in avoiding the massacre of over 3,000 members of an Iranian dissident group in Iraq, and for leading U.S. policy in Libya from a major foreign policy embarrassment to a fragile but democratic, internationally recognized government. Jonathan, thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you. First, I wish to endorse essentially every word that Tarek and Stephanie have just said. The facts that they've presented, the analysis seems to me entirely right and of great value. I'd like to focus on the international elements first, the international foreign patrons of the civil war and the potential wider proxy war that could emerge from it. Second, I'd like to talk about the Libyan actors and what I think they want and need. Third, I'd like to talk about the U.S. role and how we might get some progress. So that's the structure I'm going to address. I apologize for the noise in the back. We're all having to make do, so if there's some noise in the back of me, please forgive me. First, the international situation. I view the war in Libya today as having been driven by Libyans exploiting the interest of foreign powers in achieving their own national objectives. Russia has long wanted to have Mediterranean influence, Mediterranean ports. It began meddling in Libya in a significant way. At the time, it was meddling in the U.S. elections in 2016. It met with Haftar and it began giving Haftar and the East $16 billion roughly, or 16 billion dinars, I should say, which is even more to date in counterfeit money, which allowed for the development of patronage networks in the East, which were very substantial and made it possible for Haftar to consolidate a great deal of control. In addition, they began to provide military support as far back, as near as I can tell, as 2016. Second, MBZ in the Emirates, has always labeled anyone who is has an Islamist basis as being Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood as being pernicious to UAE interests and to the world, having played a very substantial role in El-Sisi's ascendance in Egypt with financial support. There was always in the Emirati mind, I believe, the possibility that Haftar could replicate what El-Sisi did. Haftar told me personally, as did his son's military advisor, in 2016, that he intended to invade Tripoli and conquer it within a couple of weeks by a mixture of force and acclamation, popular support, just like Gaddafi did, and then run the country as a dictator until the country was ready for democracy, which wasn't going to happen anytime soon. And then he would return to barracks when the country was ready for democracy. He also told me that the beards, which is how he characterized the Islamists, needed to be either in exile, in prison, or in the graveyards. And he then said to me, and I think we all can agree, that the graveyards would be best. I don't know what to say about the piles of bodies found recently. It certainly needs to be investigated. But I said, I don't think we all can agree on that. We don't agree on that. And that was at a meeting in Amman, Jordan in July 2016 when he made that statement. There have been efforts for years to get him into a political process. He's never reached agreement to do anything on any of them except briefly in Paris in an agreement that he immediately repudiated. So the Emirati agenda and the Haftar agenda were aligned. The Egyptian agenda, of course, is both independent of and related to the Emirati agenda. The Egyptians did not exactly want to have Muslim Brotherhood either, and were also prone to over-labeling the Libyan Turkish-like Muslim Brotherhood Party, which had not a huge amount of support, but some, as not being pluralistic, but being the same as Islamic State. That's ludicrous. They're not the same as Islamic State, not the same as Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, not the same as Ansar al-Sharia. Those groups are hegemonistic, radical terrorists, and are inconsistent with the interests of people really anywhere. So the US policy during my time was to tell everybody, get in the room together, reach alignment. I'm talking about the foreigners. Come up with a common position and tell your Libyan clients that they have to deal with one another. Don't tell them who they have to pick. Don't tell them what they have to do in terms of any particular outcome. But consistent with what Tarek has just said, have a Libyan-led process on what the agreements need to be. The UN umbrella was an effort to provide a framework environment, a safe environment for Libyans to have those discussions, and for the internationals to be facilitators and supporters of an agreement, not to be telling anybody what to do. And what I used to say to people when I was in my job was, it's not my job to tell you what to do. I have no right to tell you what to do. You have to decide. What we're going to do is try and get everybody lined up together so you have the freedom to move forward. And you're going to have to deal with one another. That you're going to have to do. And there has to be benefits to every part of the country. Nobody should be left out. And you're going to have to deal then with crime. And you're going to have to deal with terrorism, because those are common threats to everybody. And where there is support you in that, you're going to need national institutions, including a national force, to protect against criminals and against terrorists, because those are very big threats in a way that is non-political and subject to civilian rule. Haftar, of course, could never get beyond the idea of being subject to anybody, civilian or military. I was never going to accept it. So that was always a very large problem. So we've described what the Russians wanted. We described what the Emiratis wanted and what the Egyptians wanted. We've not talked about what the Turks wanted. What the Turks wanted was something like the deal that I just described, where foreigners would not be dictating Libyans' fate. Turkey could continue to get contracts, get workers in, have some influence, but it would not be militarily present. What happened after the US administration change is Mr. Trump continue to do what he loves to do, which is he talks to Mr. Erdogan and says, great, sure, happy to do it. He talks to Mr. El-Sisi and says, great, sure, happy to do it. He talks to Mr. Putin and says, sure, great, happy to do it. He talks to Mr. MBZ and says, sure, great, happy to do it. He talks to Mr. Macron and says, sure, great, happy to do it. And then after the meeting or telephone call is over, he forgets about it. And he goes on to do another political rally or attack the American press as enemy of the people, or attack President Obama as having committed treason or whatever. He is unlike any president the United States has ever had in not being serious about US policy, in my opinion, and not contributing, therefore, to solutions. So the US, in its traditional role, which is to try and bring, at least in relationship to Libya, try and bring everybody together, not dictate results, but say you got to talk and you got to work together, basically got abandoned at the senior level, leaving people at the next levels. And Stephanie was there then, I was not. So if she disagrees with me, she's going to be right and I'm going to be wrong. There was not a lot of leadership at the top. What you had was the State Department and Defense Department doing their best to try and keep the policy going to promote stability and integration. That is what I believe a Biden administration would do if Mr. Biden is elected. That is what the career government wants to do, because it's in the interest of regional stability. It's in the interest of countering terrorism. It's in the interest of countering illegal migration and humanitarian catastrophe. It's in the interest potentially of creating economic opportunity where Egyptians can come back safely into Libya and do work in Libya to supplement the Libyan workforce. It would help Tunisia. It would reduce the terrorist threat to Algeria. It would have many constructive elements and it's potentially good for to promote a future of greater Mediterranean economic integration and political cooperation. So this is obviously the right outcome. Libya has the money to be able to share revenue. My own particular formula, it's my formula, not the Libyans' formula, it's just what I think they should do, would be you put money in people's pockets by giving every Libyan with national ID a per capita payment. We do this in the United States for native Alaskans because that's where the oil comes from, but do it to every Libyan. It's a national resource. Dedicate additional revenues to the municipalities so municipalities can provide services locally. Thus, the municipalities would have a stake in continued oil production in a united Libya. The individual would have a mistake and phase out subsidies. So you are giving with one hand, taking away with the other, but you phase out subsidies because the subsidies get diverted to oil smuggling and smuggling activities, which benefits a criminal group. So that's the vision. How do you get there? Well, first, you can't have the Egyptians issuing a Cairo declaration supported by all the Arabs against the Ottomans to say the Libyan National Army will be the foundation for Libya's future national security force, and all the militias need to be broken up. The LNA is a set of militias as well, united under the leadership of one guy who wants to be a dictator. It can't be the basis for the Libyan National Army unless other groups are incorporated in an integrated way through some kind of a council of equals, which is what we were trying to do until Haftar got unleashed. So I looked at the Cairo Declaration and saw it as a series of non-starters and a negotiating tool by the Egyptians, not for actual negotiation, but to say to the Turks and everybody else, we haven't given up on our guys. We're not withdrawing. We may have lost this battle, but we haven't lost the war and we haven't given up. So what needs to happen really is for Turkey and Egypt and Russia and Germany and France and Italy and the United States and Algeria, and I know I'm leaving a bunch of people out, but Germany, for starters, and the ones I haven't added in, Portugal and Spain and Tunisia and Morocco, they all need to participate in something like Skhirat, not for the purpose of convincing Libyans of anything, but again, to recommit to what they committed to already in Paris, in Berlin, which is that they're going to stop messing around with their clients and continuing to arm them and facilitate war. I'm going to get back to CERT in a minute because it's very important. Libyans don't have to tell the Russians, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, the Sudanese, the Chadians, and so on, to take their weapons and mercenaries out, the Turks. They could do that any day of the week. They could do it right now on their own. That would send a message to the clients if they trusted one another enough to do it. Now, the Turks have got a problem in that the Egyptians have an easy land bridge. It's much easier than bringing stuff by sea or by air. It's harder to detect. So actually getting an agreement between Turkey and Egypt on how you enforceably agree to withdraw is going to be important. The Emiratis have an exception. The Emirati exception is, we're just there to fight terrorism. We're not really supporting civil war. Those mirages in the desert are not our plans. They're just mirages. That's what they said back in 2014. Just mirages in the desert. You're not really seeing them. And the counterterrorism exception proved to be a mechanism to get every imaginable thing in. These countries need to stop messing around and get serious. Now, what the United States can do, and I told you I would talk about the externals. I'll talk very briefly about Libyans, and I'm going to go to US. What Libyans want, they want to be able to trust one another enough and respect one another enough to know that everybody's going to get their fair share. Nobody's going to be able to grab it all like Gaddafi did and dole it out to everybody else, so that you don't have winners and losers, but you have mainly winners. That's what I think they want. They want justice, protection against criminals and terrorists, safety, and some share of power. That's why some system that gets money at the local level is, I think, tremendously important, and why the government has to be inclusive. Can they get that with a bunch of foreign powers supporting their favorite candidates? They can't. Can they do DDR while you have mercenaries from Syria coming in or from Chad? They can't. So near term, you actually have to get a foreign deal, I think, that's serious before you're going to be able to get fully a domestic one. So that's the first point. Second point is on CERT. How many people from the Libyan National Army lost their lives extirpating the Islamic State from CERT as a result of General Haftar's commitment to counterterrorism? Was it 1 or was it 0? I don't believe there were any. But the people of Tripolitania, Misrata and beyond, lost, when I was counting, it was up to 550. I think it may have been as high as 700 or 750 by the end. They lost a lot of fighters who gave up their lives, including some not just young soldiers, but there was a senior member of the Libyan bar who lost his life in the course of that, a lawyer, a well-respected jurist. The notion that some foreign country, any foreign country, can talk about it, there's a red line of who gets to control CERT when you have an internationally recognized government, strikes me as wild. And I don't blame the GNA for pushing back very, very hard on that. That said, we do not want a regional proxy war and war between Turkey and Egypt. So there needs to be some discussion, some meeting of the mind of the foreigners, because having Egyptians kill Turks or Turks kill Egyptians or either kill Russians is potentially quite dangerous. So that's going to have to get worked through. But it's hard for me to imagine the people of Misrata giving up CERT permanently to some other force after the sacrifice they went through in blood. Very hard to imagine. Ultimately, Libyans need to work these things out, and the foreigners need to get out of the way because they're destroying the country, and it just could get worse. That takes us to the United States. I happen to be a member of the Democratic Party. I'm not a career diplomat. I've only served as a diplomat when Democratic presidents have been in power. I've done so twice. Those have been two of the most significant portions of my own life, and the opportunity I've had to work with extraordinary human beings trying to do the right thing to make the world a better place and to deal with really difficult and intractable problems. I am so grateful to people like Tarek and Stephanie for the work that they did, and so many other people, because in general, the diplomatic community is trying very, very hard to achieve positive things. And by positive things, things like security and safety for ordinary people, political stability, economic opportunity, those kinds of things, combating humanitarian crisis, and so on. The State Department and the Defense Department understand Libya pretty well. They've got legitimate interests, and they're not, and they're trying very hard to promote universal human values, as well as deal with things like countering terrorists, so they can't just kill ordinary people. President Trump got elected in part by discrediting Hillary Clinton over Benghazi in a way that was grotesque and misread the facts of what actually happened. He's referred to all of Africa and much of the Middle East as places he doesn't want to be involved in. And as I mentioned earlier, he's transactional and tells any world leader who's an autocrat more or less what they want to hear. So while he is president, I do not imagine a tremendously active role despite the growing distress in the United States over the Russian presence. Libyans, of course, could kick Russia out. Anwar Sadat did that in Egypt a number of years ago when Sadat told the Russians they had to go, they had to leave. If I were Russia, I would not want to be trying to get a Russian military base in Libya. I think it would be a very dangerous thing for them to have, not because of anything the United States might do, but because of what inevitably the Libyans would do to push it out. So it's not a good idea for them. It's not a good idea for Turkey to try and have a long-term military presence for the same reason. Wouldn't be a good idea for the United States. Antigua Airport, I believe, was once Wheeler Air Force Base. I may be wrong about the name, but I think that's the name of it. The U.S. left it. It's the right thing to do. It should be Libyan, not American. Other countries can be there to help. They should not be there to control, direct, or determine. So what can the United States do? Well, the United States could start calling a spade when it knows of arms, humanitarian violations, embargo violations, arms violations. It should be calling them out and making them public and working with the UN panel of experts to name names. When countries violate their obligations to the United States from US-made weapons, the United States has a wide range of tools, including stopping the provision of updates to the technologies or fixing the technologies, repairing them or maintaining them. That can create a very big problem for a small country that is a regional military power but relies heavily on US equipment. Here I'm thinking about the Emirates, for example. It would be a problem for Turkey, which is a big military power and a big country that has a lot of US military equipment. Just to name another one, it'd be a problem for Egypt. We have a variety of tools in addition to sanctions, which can be powerful, which include our military-to-military cooperation. And you get Congress involved in that, that becomes a complete nightmare for the foreign countries because there's reputational consequences as well as operational consequences. Now, the US military will say, well, we've got all these other things going on. We've got concerns about Somalia. We've got concerns about what's going on in the Horn of Africa. We want to be able to project power. We don't want to have bad relations with any country. And so you don't start wildly issuing threats and taking dramatic moves. What you do say is, we're considering these things, as we should, in light of the violations that have occurred. Here are the violations, and you document them. You say, there's this one, it happened on this date, here's the photograph, here's a nice public photograph, unclassified, could be in the newspapers anywhere. And you do that privately. You then do that in the UN. You then do that in discussions with Congress. And you then finally take action if countries don't move. Now, President Obama in 2015 met with the Gulf states and told them, Qatar, Emiratis, Saudis, told them stop it in Libya, work together. That was a critical predicate for what became the Skhirat Agreement. When I was Special Envoy, I deliberately refused to engage in any discussions of who might emerge in the Presidency Council. When Fayez al-Sarraj was appointed, I was as surprised as anybody. I had no idea. That's what he was being contemplated. His role was being contemplated by Bernardino Leon. I could have found out. I chose not to. I did not want anyone to ever be able to accuse the United States of having been involved in that selection process for a government that was supposed to last 1 year. 2 years maximum as a transition. Libyans need to decide their fate. No power should have the arrogance to tell Libyans what to do there. Every power should have the arrogance of saying instability in Libya is bad for everybody, bad for the region as well as bad for Libyans. We all have an interest in not seeing a destabilized Maghreb, Sahel, MENA, Mediterranean, and beyond. So that we have rights on. We don't have the rights to tell you what to do. We have the rights to tell you what not to do, which is to be in civil war with one another. So what the US role could be is talking to the international patrons and to get very serious about the range of steps the United States could take And they do listen. It's not easy, and it has to be done in a steady, sequenced way that is respectful of every one of those countries. The United States starts trying to push Turkey around or push Russia around, push the Emirates around, Egypt, it'll backfire. But the United States has legitimate interests, and you can do it without it backfiring by being respectful but firm. And you give people the opportunity to recalibrate on the basis of it. And in my view, that should be the U.S. private role, eventually becoming a public role if it stops working, or working with great respect with the European countries, similarly, and then telling everybody it's the UN process. We can't have an Egyptian process, an Algerian process, a Russian process, a French process, a Turkish process, an American process. Then everybody is going to be going to whoever their favorite is and boycotting everybody else. One process. And you participate in that process or you lose. And how do you reduce the power of the party, of the status quo? The biggest part, you start bringing other people into the mix, like mayors of municipalities who are going to get benefits if there's a deal that allows Libya to pump oil and get revenue to them. And you tell the Libyan people, there's going to be money in your pocket if we can get a deal in place so that you're all getting money directly and you decide how to spend it, not some bureaucrat in Tripoli or some warlord or some central banker or some militia or whatever. You're going to decide. So you promote autonomy locally, and you make sure that you as an international actor are doing nothing that is pernicious. So those are my thoughts such as they are, but they build on the knowledge that I acquired both in real time from Tarek and from the other SRSGs and from the other ambassadors, and from the shared information from Stephanie Williams, who's done such a really good job in all of her roles. And I'm grateful to all of you for being here and participating in this. Thank you kindly.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I like your idea about simplifying things to one, one proposal, one plan, instead of having so multiple initiatives all over the place. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you to all three of you. And just wanted to let you know that we have a ton of questions, so we have to be very brief in the answers. Otherwise, we will be probably here through next Friday. Not tomorrow, but next week. And I'm sure you have some other commitments down the road. So let me start with a couple of the questions, starting with you, Stephanie. Is the situation in Libya drifting toward a divided Libya? Are we going to see a map of East and West Libya in the future?
Khalil, you know, Libyans don't want that. Libyans want their country to be united. They want their institutions to be united. You know, I'm struck. I've now spent almost 2 years in Libya, and the connections, the familial connections that, you know, my father was born in Benghazi. My mother is from Misrata. I went to school in Tripoli. Look, they are connected in a multiplicity of ways, and but you know, there is an undercurrent. There is a frustration on all sides. You hear more talk of federalism as well, but you know, with this now concentration of the conflict in central Libya, I think there's just like this natural inclination for people to start, draw, you know, a line, like, you know, right down the middle of the country, and that's just, you know, that's going to drive conflict. So, and I heartily believe that the vast majority of Libyans do not want that.
Thank you, Tarek. The next question is a bit technical, referring to the Skhirat agreement or meeting, and the question specifically is, was adding the High Council of State as a fourth component to the equation, was that a mistake? Did that complicate things to move forward?
I was gone when my successor, Bernardino Leon, brokered the Skhirat agreement. I think that they were sort of seeking symmetry in what they were trying to achieve. they were aware of the fact that the parliament, who had difficulties meeting, there were dissidents in the newly elected parliament, that they saw that the parliament's, the Tobruk parliament's legitimacy is being eroded. So they wanted to make sure that those who were sort of left out of the newly elected parliament are a party to the agreement. So they brought the former National Congress to life. That's probably what they tried to do.
Okay, Jonathan.
I was there, and I just want to very briefly, it was realpolitik. The General National Congress refused to go out of existence and declare itself to be the legitimate parliament of Libya in that period. The Eastern government was Eastern Parliament was operating as a rump group with only partial participation and shutting down anytime Aguila didn't felt that he couldn't control it. So this was an effort to create shared power where there was one parliament in the East that was the real parliament, but another body that was an advisory body, and that was necessary in order to get any Skhirat agreement at all. So there was some realpolitik that led to it. In practice, neither the State Council nor the Parliament have functioned well since Skhirat. One should have revised the agreements in some respects regarding them, but that's a longer conversation than we can have right now.
Jonathan, let me direct the next series of questions about Egypt to you. What makes CERT a red line for Egypt? And is Egypt, Sisi, risking a quagmire, as our friend John Alterman wrote yesterday on the Hill? And just another related question, is Cairo going to war, as our friend Yazid Sayegh also wrote yesterday in his Diwan, Carnegie's publication?
I think it's very important to note the risk of miscalculation that Stephanie Williams raised earlier. Egypt is sending messages to Turkey, and it's sending messages to the GNA that Egypt will not allow itself to be humiliated by a move all the way to the eastern border. It has a legitimate interest in wanting safety in the East. That's completely 100% legitimate. It is threatened by terrorist groups, and there's that warning. Why CERT? It's because they don't want the humiliation of Haftar to be so comprehensive that everything they built in the East falls apart completely, and they're irretrievably weakened, and Turkey winds up with a victory and taking things all the way towards their border. So is CERT really the red line? I don't think it is myself, but they want to create at least a pause to try and have the war not go any further. And if you look at geographically where CERT is, that's kind of 50-50. It's not traditionally where the East begins, after all. That is further to the East, but it's kind of right in the middle. So it's an effort to say, okay, you got back the West, let's leave things in place and get to a ceasefire. So I see it as a overstatement of the actual position to create diplomatic breathing room to get a ceasefire in place, halt the advance. Will Fadi Bashaga and the Tripolitanians accept this? I don't think so, but they might have to if the Turks told them you must not move. So it's part of a complicated diplomatic military game with risks all the way around. I think it's unfortunate that the rhetoric was raised that high. This should be determined by Libyans, not by foreigners. And again, what would be the right solution? You have local people from CERT defending CERT. The military forces leave all the way around. And so nobody wins and nobody loses. You have a more normal situation, demilitarized. So far as I know, no universal being who created the earth decided to give General Haftar control over the oil crescent. He grabbed it. He grabbed it. So all of these places need to be demilitarized, subject to local control, and made secure in ways that allow people to live their lives free from the fear of being killed by a soldier, by a criminal or by a terrorist. That's going to require some diplomatic activity to promote trust, respect, justice, protection against impunity, protection against criminals and terrorists, and some local share of power. That's the outcome. How you get there initially is through talking. If you don't get there through talking, you run the risk of getting there through conquest. It's been a whole game of conquest for a while. I want to very briefly add to it. What are the alternatives to a UN deal? Because I was going to say this before and forgot. Okay, conquest of the whole country by Haftar becomes a military dictator. That's option one. I don't know too many people who think that's going to happen at this point. Option two is the GNA takes over the whole country, helped by Turkey and the mercenaries Turkey has brought in, takes it all the way to the east, past Tobruk, exiles or in prisons, I guess, the people who've been opposing them, has Barca create guerrilla forces against them. The country's in turmoil there. I don't think that's going to happen. The next one's partition of the country de facto. That's a real risk, but it's not sustainable. Even the oil doesn't fit any particular line. It crosses too much territory. So that means potential oil shutdowns and perpetual instability. So partition takes you into ongoing periodic war, which is against everybody's interests. That takes you back to alternative one. Is there an alternative to a UN brokered set of political discussions? Haftar doesn't work. GNA taking the country doesn't work. Partition doesn't work. You have to get back to a political deal. That's it. Every time you go, if you really think it through, I don't care whether you're Russia, Egypt, Emiratis, Turks, French, Italians, forget the Americans. Nothing else works. That's where we have to go. Thank you.
The next question or series of questions come from Karim, who is well versed clearly in the history of Libya. There's a long comment. Unfortunately, we don't have time to read his comment. However, I will convey his bottom line question to Tarek. For peace and stability to find its way in Libya, the United States and its allies, the international community should, through the United Nations, promote a political solution that begins with the return to the 1951 Constitution, which in his comment, he elaborates on the development of that. What's your comment on that, Tarek? Do you think something like this would work, or is worthwhile focusing on a return to the 51 Constitution?
First of all, I'm not sure issues related to the Constitution are to be dealt with by foreign powers, whoever they are. I think the Security Council, even in times where it was united, never said a word about the constitutional process. All we were interested in was to set in motion a process that leads to the elaboration of a constitution, a new social contract. But as we moved along the road, and so there were so many obstacles on the way, and it was at that time that people said, why not go back to the Constitution of 1951? The reason I think people said this had to do with what they saw as the incapacity of the Libyans to agree on a social contract. You know, a constitution is not just a legal text. A constitution is a foundational document. It's a document that is supposed to reinvent Libya, so to speak. And I don't think the Libyans were ready for that exercise. So the easy way is to say, let's go back. There is a great deal of nostalgia in Libya. You know, when people, very few people are nostalgic of Gaddafi time, if any. But then, but they are nostalgic of King Idris. There are people in the East, in particular, they romanticize the period or the reign of King Idris as a virtuous man who, while a monarch, was never authoritarian, and they see the constitution as it was in 51 as a progressive document. So it's an easy way out of the painful, difficult discussion to draft a new constitution.
Okay, the next question would be directed to Stephanie from Abdul Hamid Siam. Says you have not, I think you did mention the mass graves found in Tarhuna, but how accurate is the information about these mass graves? And do you think that General Haftar is really qualified to take part in future talks?
Okay, yeah, I did. I'm sorry if you didn't hear it, but I did actually mention, I think I quite pointedly mentioned the grisly discovery of these mass graves in and around Tarhuna. And of course, you know, the matter has also been referred to the ICC. We've seen the statement of Madam Bensouda. We in UNSMIL are providing our best advice and guidance to the Government of National Accord, to the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Interior, and indeed the acting public prosecutor has a very important role to play here. So yes, there are graves. I think the important thing right now is to ensure that the evidence is preserved, that the sites are protected, and because if this is a matter to be referred to the International Criminal Court, then international standards need to be followed. And that's what we are a support mission, and that's what we're on the ground to do, is to, in our way, provide the best guidance to the government, to the national authorities in their efforts. And we are also obviously in touch with the ICC, the Commission in Geneva, the ICRC has a role. I mean, there are sort of numerous international entities. Look, with regard to the role of any of the political actors in Libya moving forward, here's my comment. There is a crisis of legitimacy in Libya, touches all institutions, and this is what has, you know, driven. I mean, going back, I'm sure, to Dr. Tarek's time and all the way forward through when Ghassan started his tenure in 2017, is you know, really working on a formula to address this crisis of legitimacy, this conflict, which is over resources and power. And, you know, again, I go back to what I said, which was the solutions here are not mysterious. They're you know, in hand. We know that, you know, at some point, you could reduce the Presidency Council, and there are, you know, many efforts towards that. You need a new technocratic government. You need to separate the Prime Minister job from the Presidential Council. You need a government that is focused on delivering services. You need a genuine electoral roadmap and all of the complexities involved, including what do you do about, do you have a referendum on the draft constitution? Do you, as was suggested by Karim, do you go back to the 1951 constitution? There are a number of options, but there's nothing that is inherently impossible here. You know, Libya, the Libyan case, you know, is not an impossible case. It takes international will, it takes some domestic goodwill as well. And it takes, you know, the foreign actors removing their hands from the country. You know, it's not benign, you know, neglect in Libya. It's a very malign foreign interference right now. And so in the end, the Libyans will decide who's around the table. You know, this has got to be a Libyan-led and Libyan-owned discussion. I mean, I think we've spent a lot of time here saying, you know, foreigners should not dictate, you know, who sits around the table of a Libyan negotiation. And so, I mean, I think if you get into General Haftar is not there, then, is Khalil Mitri is not there, then Aguila is not there, and then, you know, that's a non-starter. And there is this overly, you know, intense focus on personalities in Libya, and an under focus and concentration on institutions. And that's where I think, you know, the international community has also fallen short, because if we had invested in, you know, the necessary institution building, then you could have, you know, addressed these shortfalls, the rampant corruption, the lack of accountability. I know that I saw there was a question on the oil revenues. Well, there are no oil revenues now. There's been an oil blockade since January. Why? Because it's a struggle over resources, and so a political solution needs to have a strong economic component. That's all on the menu and agreed to in Berlin, integrated now into these Libyan tracks, which I think reflect previous models. And so there is a solution here, but everyone needs to, and the international community also needs to take Libya off the second order of priority and put it on the first order of priority before this thing spins further out of control. Thanks.
Thank you. All three of you have been very gracious with your time, and considering the continuing onslaught in terms of questions, the interest is really massive from our attendees. If you don't mind, can I prevail on you to spend a couple more minutes to try to answer a few more questions? One is from our colleague, Gregory Aftandilian, who's interested in the Libyan oil industry, and this is addressed to Jonathan. Is the revenues that Stephanie just referred to, the resources of the country, are they, particularly in oil, are they being effectively used at this point to the benefit of the civilian populations, or are they just being manipulated by the belligerents for their own military purposes?
I'm going to give you the shortest version I can of something I could go on for some extended time. The central bank based in Tripoli has continued to provide payments to individuals based on formulas agreed to at the end of the GNC period. So it continues, as near as I can tell, to provide those funds. So there's transfer payments being made, and that has been a stabilizer in part and a destabilizer in part. It's a stabilizer because it provides a foundation for everybody to continue. It's a destabilizer in that even those opposing the government, fighting against it, continue to get paid, which I've never seen in any other country in the world. The central bank governor husbands his resources, so he doesn't give the government to the West everything it wants, relying on the fact that there's no budget process anymore. He's tended to perpetuate the budget process that was last approved in roughly 2014-15, I think at the end of 2014 for 2015. And so there have been supplemental budgets in addition to that made available by the GNA. The corruption that Stephanie referred to is in a substantial part been driven by letters of credit. Who gets letters of credit and how their use of letters of credit is monitored. There's a very limited monitoring system. In addition, the East has essentially borrowed money with phony loans. They're not really loans, they're really requisitions from Eastern banks. And then there's the problem of the counterfeit dinars. So is the oil money being completely abused? No. The subsidy system makes no sense. The subsidy system it creates tremendous waste, fraud, and abuse. There are a limited number of things you could do, meaning not very many, that would really make a very big difference in leveraging the resources Libya has. This can't go on. Nobody knows at this point other than Saad Kabir, and there may be others, but I don't know how much is left of Libya's sovereign wealth. The LIA funds continue to be frozen, which is a good thing because that will provide a cushion for when things finally get back to normal and there's an integrated government. So the future actually looks bright if you could get beyond the present. If you could actually get to the point where the country was pumping its 2 million barrels a day at $40, $50 a barrel or more, you could quite rapidly get to a situation where you could have normal economic life. In the meantime, money continues to get brought down, reduced. There's a potential crisis. There's inflation due to the counterfeit dinars. There's corruption on the letters of credit. All of this is fixable in theory. It hasn't. None of it's been fixed yet. Thank you.
The next cluster of questions deal with the Berlin process, and I'm going to direct him both to both Tarek and Stephanie. First of all, what can and should the U.S. do to support the various Berlin processes? and what can be tweaked in this Berlin process to kind of produce better results than the previous processes, if you will, from past experience. Tarek?
Let me hear Stephanie on this first.
Okay. Stephanie, please.
Sorry, I didn't pick up the first part of the question.
Yeah, the first,
was it what can the U.S. do?
yes.
Or what can the
what can the U.S. do to support the Berlin process?
Well, I would say that the U.S. is a good and active member of the Berlin process. Look, there's a lot of herding cats kind of that has to take place here in the international community. That is a role. I'll go back to what I said about the Europeans because I saw there was also a question about the Europeans and why. With the logic behind Berlin was because of the divisions in the Security Council and that made it very hard for the mission and for the mediator at the time, the former SRSG, you know, who are you representing here? When you represent a divided international community, Libyans naturally get rather confused because they look behind you and they don't see, you know, a united front. So the Europeans, I think there was an opportunity, and there still is an opportunity, and I think Operation Irini is a good step. But there is an opportunity for the Europeans collectively to use the leverage of the union, their economic, their trading, and their investment relationships to put, you know, the pressure needed on the regional powers who are fueling the conflict. I think, look, for the U.S., you know, a minor investment. So Libyans, it's not a secret, are desperate for a U.S. role. And they, you know, a small investment on the part of the U.S., and particularly in this need to herd the cats internationally, to exercise some discipline within the context, and this can be done within the context of Berlin, and it is calling things out, naming names. And that, you know, I hope, I've seen a really positive change in U.S. policy, particularly following last September. No surprise, it's because they got their antenna went up with the mercenary presence in Tripoli, and I think that can be built upon. I think that they should be looking now at what's happening and realizing that the security of the Southern Mediterranean is at risk, and that has all kinds of implications for U.S. national security. So, I mean, I hope that the call is heard, and Libya is not a terrorism issue. Libya is not a migrant issue. Libya is, we have to take a holistic approach to Libya. You can't just stovepipe your interests and say, someone else will take care of that, and I'll focus here. No. And that's why this collective international action to preserve peace and security, which is the business that we are in at the UN, and we need the support of not only the US, of all of the P5, and indeed beyond. Thanks.
Tarek, would you care to comment on that, please?
I think the United States has means to put some diplomatic pressure on many countries who are nominally, formally, apparently its allies. And I think some of the countries that are interfering in Libya or threatening to interfere are friends of the United States, but no diplomatic pressure has been put on any of them. Europe is another problem. I think short of reconciling France and Italy and having a common European position, there is little Europe can do. Now, the ability of European countries to agree on foreign policy issues has proven to be limited. But with Frau Merkel convening Berlin, I think she has the moral clout that might help France and Italy transcend some of their petty divisions and possibly give more energy to the post-Berlin process.
Thank you, Tarek. I appreciate this last comment because that answers a couple of the questions that we have with regards to the EU differences and the absence of an EU joint position on this. Let's conclude with this question from Dr. Hani Shanib, President of the National Council on US-Libyan relations. He addresses the question to Stephanie, but if the two other speakers would like to comment, feel free to do so, and we will conclude with that. Dr. Shanib says, basically, regardless of the design of the future political process in Libya, it is clear that a UN support mission will not be enough on its own. Do you think that the UN leadership today has the appetite and is ready to advance its official role in Libya from support to intervention level, as per Kosovo, for example?
Okay, well, I will be interested to hear Tarek's answer first. Look, first of all, ahlan, Dr. Hani, and I'm a big fan of Dr. Hani's really good work in Libya. He's a wonderful doctor and a very caring person for his compatriots. Look, we work for the Security Council, and it is if our mandate gets changed, that's got to go through the security. So I'm not sure Libyans themselves want peacekeepers. Certainly within the context of the 5+5, what we have been talking about is a ceasefire mechanism with, unarmed personnel and under UN umbrella. But I mean, you're talking essentially mostly civilian observers. Peacekeeping, a whole other sort of basket of complexities. Now, you will also no doubt be following that there is interest from the United States in changing the nature of UNSMIL somewhat by having a special envoy and an SRSG on the ground. Special envoy sort of, circling the globe, going to the different capitals, and SRSG on the ground. And that's a model that has been used elsewhere. I mean, I don't want to get into all the details on that, but again, even that has to go to the Security Council because our mandate now is we are under an SRSG. So there's a lot of sort of, bureaucratic, hurdles that have to be crossed in order for all of that to happen. Tarek.
Well, I think in view of the present situation, in terms of world politics and in terms of what the UN will look like in the future, I am doubtful as to any significant change in the role and the size of UNSMIL. I think the role of convener, mediator, providing expertise whenever this is possible, will continue to be determining as far as I could see. The problem is that there is an original sin, if I may use the word original sin. When that is the United Nations support mission in Libya was created at a time where Libya needed much more. It was created at a time when Libya needed a stabilization force, when Libya did not need only experts to help in building institutions and advisors to advise in constitution processes and experts to help organizing elections. That was far less than what Libya needed at that time. And from day one, therefore, you had tasks that you were given were huge, and the tools at your disposal were very, very limited. And therefore, it's in a way unfortunate to say, I say it with a lot of pain. You know, in the DNA of UNSMIL, limitation is there from day one. You know, it's much more is expected from the UN than it is able to do.
Okay, our time is definitely up at this time. I really appreciate the richness of your presentations. All three of you were great. Appreciate the presence of so many people participating throughout the session. And again, thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Dr. Tarek. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please join us in future events regarding the Arab world, developments in the Arab world, and US policy towards the Arab world. Thank you very much and have a safe and good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Khalil.